A quiet morning in London, grey skies hanging low over Buckingham Palace, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound itself. Behind those historic walls, where centuries of tradition have been preserved, something far less visible is unfolding. Not a ceremony, not a celebration, but a conversation that would shake the foundations of royal perception. And at the center of it all, a name that has remained one of the most controversial in modern royal history, Prince Andrew. For decades, the British royal family has been built on image, stability, distance, control, every gesture measured, every statement carefully crafted. But there are moments when even the most powerful institutions face pressure they cannot fully contain. Moments when silence becomes impossible to maintain. And this is one of those moments. Whispers begin long before anything is confirmed. That's how it always starts. Not in public announcements, not in official statements, but in private corridors, behind closed doors, in conversations that never make it to the cameras. Something has changed. A shift in tone, a shift in urgency. Those close to the situation describe it not as discussion anymore, but instruction. Not advice, but expectation. And the message is simple. Leave, not symbolically, not temporarily, but completely removed from visible royal life. Withdrawn from public association. Stepped away from the environment that has defined identity, privilege, and status for an entire lifetime. It sounds almost unbelievable when spoken aloud. But within the structure of monarchy, even the unspoken carries weight. Because in the royal family, nothing is random, and nothing like this is ever said without reason. To understand how a moment like this could even exist, you have to go back, not just to recent headlines, but to the slow accumulation of pressure over years. Public scrutiny, legal controversy, media attention that never fully disappeared. Each layer building on the last, until the structure itself began to feel unstable. Prince Andrew was once seen very differently. A decorated naval officer, a royal representative on the global stage, someone who carried the image of tradition into modern diplomacy. But perception changes quickly in the public eye, and once trust is questioned, it rarely returns in the same form. What followed was not a single event, but a chain reaction. Interviews, public backlash, official distancing, reduced duties, then silence, a retreat from public royal engagements that once defined his position. But even silence does not erase presence, because within the institution itself, roles are not just ceremonial, they are structural. Every member has a function, a place, a purpose in the larger architecture of monarchy. And when one part becomes destabilized, the pressure is not just external, it becomes internal. And that is where the tension begins to build. Insiders describe a growing discomfort. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. A sense that a continued association between the institution and the individual is no longer sustainable in its current form. And when institutions begin to prioritize survival over tradition, decisions become sharper, faster, less flexible. There is a moment in every crisis where delay becomes risk. And in those moments, language changes. Advice becomes expectation. Expectation becomes pressure. Pressure becomes instruction. And instruction becomes a point of no return. The phrase "leave now" is not just about physical distance. It represents separation from visibility, from representation, from association with the core identity of the monarchy in the public sphere. It is not spoken lightly, because within royal structure, symbolic presence carries meaning far beyond appearance. It is about perception, trust, and continuity. And when that continuity is questioned, everything else begins to shift with it. Outside the palace walls, the public narrative grows louder. Speculation spreads faster than clarification. Social media amplifies every rumor, every interpretation, every fragment of unverified detail. And in that environment, truth and perception often blur into the same space. But inside the institution, the tone is different, controlled, measured, strategic. There is no room for emotional reaction, only calculation, because every decision now carries consequences beyond individuals. It affects a monarchy as a whole, its reputation, its stability, its future relevance in a rapidly changing world where transparency is demanded more than tradition. And so the pressure builds quietly, but consistently. Those close to the situation describe it as a final stage conversation, not necessarily dramatic in tone, but definitive in implication. The kind of conversation where options are no longer being discussed, only outcomes. Step back voluntarily, or be separated by necessity. That is the underlying structure. But even within that, there's complexity. Because this is not just about only what comes after. Outside, the world continues to watch. Analysts interpret every movement. Headlines attempt to simplify what is fundamentally complex. But inside the walls, the reality remains quieter than the noise outside suggests. Because power, in its most traditional form, does not announce itself with emotion. It moves with restraint, with timing, with precision. And that is what makes moments like this so significant. Not because they are loud, but because they are final in implication. As time passes, details may become clearer. Statements may eventually be made. Narratives will continue to evolve. But the underlying reality will remain unchanged. A shift has already occurred. And once institutions shift, they rarely shift back. The story is no longer just about controversy, or headlines, or public reaction. It has become something larger. A question of how tradition survives in a world that no longer accepts silence as explanation, and how long any institution can balance legacy with accountability before one finally outweighs the other. In the end, there are moments in history that are not defined by what is said publicly, but by what is understood privately. And this is one of them. A moment where pressure becomes decision, where decision becomes direction, and where direction changes everything that follows. Because when the message is finally understood in full, there's only one certainty left. Nothing remains the same after it. The atmosphere around the monarchy does not shift suddenly. It moves like tide water against stone, slow, persistent, and unavoidable. By the time the public notices a change, it has often already been in motion for weeks, sometimes months. Inside that controlled world, time feels different. Decisions are not made in reaction to headlines, but in anticipation of what headlines will become. And when a situation reaches a point where internal conversations begin aligning around a single outcome, it signals something deeper than crisis management. It signals resolution forming. And in that quiet space between discussion and action, the weight of consequence becomes clear. Prince Andrew remains a figure defined by contrast, a life once associated with duty, military service, and royal representation, now viewed through a far more complicated public lens. That contrast is part of what makes this moment so sensitive within the institution itself. Because a monarchy does not operate purely as a family. It operates as a symbol. And symbols depend on perception as much as reality. When perception begins to fracture, repair is not always possible through explanation alone. Sometimes, separation becomes the only remaining tool. That is why the phrase "leave now," whether interpreted literally or institutionally, carries meaning far beyond physical relocation. It suggests distance from visibility, from engagement, from the daily machinery of royal representation that connects tradition to the modern world. And in the structure of monarchy, visibility is not neutral. It is identity. To be seen is to represent. To represent is to reflect. And to reflect means carrying responsibility not just for oneself, but for the image of something far larger. So when that connection becomes unstable, pressure does not remain external for long. It becomes internal. There are moments, according to those familiar with institutional dynamics, when decisions are framed not as punishment, but as preservation. Not as rejection, but as protection of the broader system. That distinction matters deeply within royal thinking. Because every action is measured not only by immediate effect, but by historical interpretation. What will this decision look like in 10 years? In 20? In a future where today's controversy becomes archived history? That long-view thinking is what defines royal decision-making more than anything else. And in that long view, instability is rarely tolerated indefinitely, outside the palace. However, time moves differently again. The public does not experience gradual institutional calculation. It experiences moments. Headlines, statements, images, short bursts of information that attempt to summarize complex realities. And in that environment, narratives simplify quickly. Supporters interpret restraint as caution. Critics interpret silence as avoidance. Observers interpret distance as confirmation. And between all of those interpretations, truth becomes fragmented. But within the palace, fragmentation is not the priority. Control or continuity is. That is why conversations at this level are not emotional. They are structural. Focus on maintaining institutional integrity even when individual situations become difficult to reconcile publicly. And that is where the tension becomes most visible. Because individuals live within consequences, but institutions live beyond them. As pressure continues to build, one reality becomes unavoidable: association carries cost. And in the modern era, that cost is amplified by global visibility. Every connection is magnified, every association scrutinized, every decision interpreted through multiple lenses at once. In previous generations, distance could be managed quietly. In today's world, silence itself becomes content. That shift has changed everything. For the royal family, adaptability is no longer optional. It is necessary for continuity. And adaptability sometimes requires decisions that are emotionally complex but structurally clear. So when insiders refer to final warnings, it is not necessarily theatrical language. It reflects escalation in urgency, a narrowing of options, but internal alignment. And once alignment happens, the external world eventually follows. The story of Prince Andrew, in this context, is not just about one individual. It becomes part of a larger reflection on how institutions respond when tradition, modern scrutiny, and public expectation collide. Because monarchy is not static. It evolves under pressure, even when that evolution appears reluctant. And every moment of evolution carries tension between continuity and change. At times, that tension becomes visible through absence, reduced appearances, fewer public roles, gradual withdrawal from ceremonial visibility. And in other cases, it becomes more decisive, complete separation from active representation, not always announced with emphasis, sometimes simply implemented. And that is where speculation often grows fastest, when clarity is replaced with gradual transition rather than formal declaration. But within institutional frameworks, gradual transition is often intentional. It allows stability while change occurs beneath the surface. It avoids shock. It preserves structure. It protects continuity. And above all, it prevents disruption from overwhelming the system all at once. Yet even in gradual transitions, one thing remains constant: perception eventually catches up. And when it does, the public narrative solidifies into simplified understanding of what was, in reality, a layered and prolonged process. As time moves forward, the weight of history begins to settle over current events. What feels immediate today becomes contextual tomorrow, and what feels uncertain now becomes chaptered later. For Prince Andrew, this moment exists within that in-between space, not fully defined by the past, not yet fully written into the future, but positioned at a point where direction matters more than interpretation. Because once institutional direction is set, everything else begins to adjust around it. And that is the nature of structures built to last centuries. They do not move quickly, but when they move decisively. Outside the palace gates, the world will continue to debate, analyze, and reinterpret every detail. That is the nature of public attention. It demands closure even when closure is still unfolding. But inside, the process is different. Less about reaction, more about resolution.